Thank you, Mbak Sandra and Bahasa Global team. That was a very cheerful tune. I can see myself and Gareth was tapping into the music. Anyway, welcome everybody to day 3. Mbak Sandra, can you move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So welcome to day 3 of our training. And over the last few days, we've heard, on the first day, we've heard Gareth, Gaynor, and Ian and Mark speaking about the UK energy transition journey with island case studies. And then yesterday we had Duncan and Craig, as well as Gareth and John, spoke about the grid management and some technical considerations. Now, we're moving on to day 3 after we have covered through the first 2 days some of the topics as follows. We have touched on the approaches of introducing new technology to energy actors and stakeholders. We've also touched a bit around subsea cabling and around what is required to move between coal-based and renewable-based power agreements. And then we also had discussed quite significant issues around the transmission reliability after introducing high-level penetration of renewable energy, and we've touched on the capacity of the grid to deal with multiple small-scale additional generations. So today, in the third day, we're going to cover 3 topics. And the first one is on understanding UK renewable energy policy landscape, and then we'll go into the opportunities that Indonesia may have to leapfrog, and also going back and reflect on Indonesia's policy and strategy and what can be suggested as a way forward. Next slide, please, Masandra. For this first topic, Gareth will be with you, and he will cover certain issues, including, next slide, please, Masandra. The market and on-market incentives, regulatory framework, and some social framework for success. So before Gareth start, can I remind participants to register, put in your attendance through the registration link, as this will count and contribute to the mechanisms of issuing your certificates. And the other thing that I'd like to remind participants is to also put your questions and comments through the chat box as we go, if you'd like, both in Bahasa Indonesia or in English, and we'll have a dedicated Q&A and discussions after Gareth's speaking. Over to you, Gareth.
Thank you very much, Nia, and great to see you all on this third day of the training. And hopefully we can build to a big crescendo, building on this very great music that introduces us each morning. So I'll just get my slides working. And what I wanted to do was, first of all, to maybe reflect on some of the realities that there have been in the UK market. And I think you have heard from all of the presenters that the UK is an example of definitely some great things to do, but also some things that maybe we don't want to repeat in other places because we've made some mistakes and we've taken too long to do some things. So I wanted to give you some of the background context for that and start to think about how we can draw these lessons into the Indonesian context, which Nia and then the two of us will deal with in the next sessions. So first of all, starting off with some of the good things. So over the last 20 years or so, maybe last 30 years, you know, as we've seen from a number of the presenters, the UK has gone through this incredibly ambitious transition. It started us moving our electricity from coal and oil into renewables, and we've had a considerable success at that, and in certain parts of the country have moved ahead of others, and as you know, Orkney is one of the leading places in that journey. But that transition is happening in transport with the adoption of electric vehicles. It's happening in our housing in terms of local or individual people improving insulation and the energy efficiency of lighting. And it's also happening with the industrial transition, with some of our old infrastructure now being demolished and replaced by modern carbon-free sources. But the reality that we've had to live through in the UK is that there have been some, if you like, energy system lowlights as well. So some of these have been in relation to pollution. In the 90s in particular, we flared off a lot of our gas from our oil and gas fields in the North Sea in a dash for production. We've had accidents that have caused major loss of life. We've actually had social unrest around energy, particularly in relation to the coal strikes and the road fuel strikes. And we have some quite deep-rooted social problems. As you can imagine, in the UK, heating is a need, and we have an issue called fuel poverty, where too many people in our country don't have enough money to keep themselves warm in the winter months. And we also have the issues around air pollution that arises from our use of fossil fuel, and the waste that still lingers from our nuclear program. So all of these things are if you like, issues, real issues, that is our lived experience. So energy is not something that just goes off into a box for somebody else to deal with. These are realities that across our country we've had to deal with as a population. And so the positives and the negatives of energy are things that we have to reflect on. And in particular, in this idea of learning and making it better in the future, we need to stop doing the things that are bad, frankly, and do more of the things that are good. And so that message is coming out loud and clear, not only from us in the UK, but also our international community. So the Paris Accord was obviously a key moment in terms of the world agreeing that climate change is its greatest present danger, and signing up for a transition. And being part of the UK was a very positive, being part of the EU was a very positive process for the UK as well. And in the last 2 years, in particular, two characters, David Attenborough, who's one of our most loved TV presenters, and Greta Thunberg, who's an incredible young activist. David Attenborough's in his mid-90s now, and Greta, as you know, is just a teenager. So at that end of the age spectrum, we have two characters that have really been important in terms of shifting public opinion and getting people and politicians and businesses to start to act in a more dynamic way. So we've been on this journey, and this journey, if you look at it, it actually goes back to, the 1700s, when we started the Industrial Revolution. The UK has been at the forefront of that in the early stages and led to a number of the emissions issues that then have traveled around the world. So the UK has a particular responsibility here to maybe embrace these new essential ways of working with energy and to help promote them in the future. And in terms of the market mechanisms that we've used, I think you've hopefully seen through the presentations that there's a number of mechanisms that are used. And I've just picked out some examples here in the electricity market, but it's also important to understand that there's also a fuel market. It's not just about electrons, it's also about molecules. But in the electricity market, we have mechanisms that have been guided towards the consumer, towards people like me in my homes and the businesses that we run. And there have also been mechanisms that have been geared towards the generator. And these mechanisms have looked at things like access, they've looked at things like pricing, they've looked at how we use energy and electricity, and, for example, the competitiveness of alternatives. And so in our lives, we see different signals that are emerging from government and from the sector about how we should use energy. And the same for the generators. The generators have signals that come from your ability to sell electricity, to your ability to access the grid, the actual costs that it takes to access the grid, and the availability of the grid. Is there a grid in the places that we need it to be able to operate? And as we've said all along, some of these mechanisms have been very successful. Others of them have failed or have not delivered what is needed. So it's important to realize that there's a basket of things that probably need to be done, but they need to be aligned in a common purpose. Now, when it comes down to specific regulations, as with any government and country and bureaucracy, there's a whole set of legal instruments that have been used. And for those of you that have been really keen on the polls and the tests that follow each of these talks, I would say concentrate on the letters here, because you might well get a question asking you about some of these measures. So what's happening here is we've got a sequence of regulatory instruments that go back to 2000, which have created an environment of incentives and tried to create the right incentives for the energy system going forward. But the fact that we have a list of, what is that, probably 10 or 12 different instruments also perhaps suggests that the first instruments weren't optimal and we had to change them as they've gone along, or it's been chosen to change them. And it's probably an open question about whether we've arrived at the optimal conclusion now. There are certainly things along the way that have been very successful from a transition point of view, but they've come at a certain monetary cost. And it's a lively discussion about whether we've paid too much for the transition that's occurred to date, or whether we haven't actually invested enough. And there's many political discussions about that. But things like the feed-in tariffs, like the renewable obligation certificates, these were incredibly successful things in creating change, particularly at the smaller scale and across communities. The contracts for difference have been very successful in driving offshore wind, but have been perhaps less successful in maintaining the momentum for those smaller developments. But what we've seen, and you've seen this graph in many different ways, showing this decline in coal and the emergence of other sectors, and particularly the increase in wind and renewables, and more recently also the increase in imported energy from Europe. And this has allowed us to make this transition. And the reason I've included this graph is you can see here the seasonal variation that takes place in our energy production. And so that's something to bear in mind when we see smooth graphs of transition going on. We have to remember that there are likely to be peaks and troughs, perhaps on a seasonal basis, certainly on a daily basis, and certainly also on a geographical basis, that need to be worked into the system. And what we can also see is that this transition, I think you've heard, particularly in my presentations about Orkney, where we've been very successful in decarbonising our electricity supply, but actually we still have a huge job to do in terms of transport and some of the other sectors that use energy. And that's our next task. And looking forward to Indonesia, it was great to hear from Pat Chris that there's an emphasis going into electric vehicles and the decarbonisation of transportation, as well as the electricity supply. So despite all of these great things that we've been doing, the reality at the moment is that the UK is just straying away from the pathway that takes us to our Paris Agreement commitments. And so what is happening literally as we speak is the government and the public are engaging in a discussion about how we can accelerate our transition and basically get more offshore wind, get more onshore, or start again onshore wind deployment, to put even more focus on the rollout of electric vehicles. And that will involve the banning of the use of internal combustion engine vehicles by certain dates. There's a renewed interest in shipping and aviation, and looking at new business models like Reflex that you've heard about. So there's a number of actions being taken, and this is going to be the reality for any country over the next 2 or 3 decades. We have a plan, we try and go down the curve towards net zero. We may stray away from that. We have to adapt the plan to get back onto that trajectory. And if we can be lucky enough to get early and deeper than we would have anticipated, then that's going to be great, because in the end, achieving the climate change or combating climate change early is in the end going to be cheaper than leaving it too late. So in terms of the infrastructure that's needed, yesterday we had some great presentations from National Grid explaining how they use their systems, but we still have a huge challenge in the UK about spreading the access to that grid to cover the resource-rich areas. If you look at this map on the left, you can see that a lot of the grid is around London and the southeast and our industrial heartlands in England. But as you come up to the resource-rich areas of Scotland, the grid thins out. And if we look on the right, these bright green areas are the areas where offshore wind is going to be cheapest to develop, and this is where our energy is going to come from in the future. So we need to build infrastructure from our demand centres in the south to our resource centres in the north. So that's a major change we have to make. And we also need to think about this interconnectivity with Europe and think about how our energy supplies can help each other. When the wind's blowing and the conditions are good for energy production in the UK, they may be less good in France and Spain, for example. So can we share resources and vice versa? And of course, that infrastructure needs to link in, as I say, between the resource-rich areas in the north and the demand-rich areas in the south. So having looked at that, what I want to do now is just touch on the regulatory framework and two areas in particular around planning and consenting. So what's really important with all of this change, the amount of money that's going to be spent, as I said in an earlier presentation, it's going to take around £1 trillion to be spent over the next 20 years to undertake the transition. So we need really good planning of how that £1 trillion is going to be spent. And that needs to be successful to embrace economic and social planning to ensure sustainability, as well as the industrial and the technology and economic planning that makes it deliver from a technical point of view. So we need that balance between the technical and economic delivery and the environmental delivery. We also need to think about best practices in planning. Planning can be an incredibly powerful tool, but it can also become an obstacle if it's not implemented in the right way. And levels of communication, levels of engagement in planning, and getting inputs from all the stakeholders early on before plans are finalized is absolutely key. In terms of the consenting and permitting, this is in a sense a more regularly tested mechanism, and in all countries in the world there are well-developed consenting and permitting regimes. You can have a discussion about how well those regimes deliver outcomes that are right for a broad range of people. But it's true that the level of change that we're going to be going through in the future means that this system has to work well, and the tools that we need to deliver that exist. That there are very good consenting processes and permitting processes in the world, and they're implemented on regular occasions. It's just that they're not always implemented. So what we need to do is up the success rate of that, and making sure that we don't bog things down. If there's a bad project, we need to say as early as possible, hopefully before people have invested too much, to say, look, this is not a good place or a good way to do it. If there's a good project, again, we need to make the commitment that that's an acceptable way forward, and then on the journey make it even better as it goes along to actual final approval, but not suddenly feel that the project can drop off at the last stage. If that happens, it means it was probably a bad project and it should have been stopped earlier. And the third element here is about the license to operate. So who is going to operate our energy systems in the future? Is it going to be the structure that we've had for the last 10, 20, 30 years, or is it going to be new? And as you heard again from Duncan and ourselves in Orkney, we've moved in the UK from a system where our energy mix was run by perhaps 20 companies, to a situation now where literally we have thousands of energy generators contributing to our energy system. That is going to be a more distributed energy system. So it feels to us that that is a reality, is an unavoidable reality. So we need to embrace that and see the benefits that come from that. And we think there are a lot of benefits in terms of community empowerment, and providing opportunities for maybe some of the previous peripheral communities and regions to make a bigger economic contribution on a national basis, but also creating greater robustness and self-reliance within communities as well. So what does that lead us to in terms of looking for a social framework for success? Basically, I'm so more confident in the last year about our ability to take on these big change challenges. And the reason for that is that I've seen us in countries and in the world embrace change in ways that I didn't think was possible. So if you think of digital connectivity and access to air travel, property development, and levels of transport and mobility on our streets, all of these things have changed recently, and I'm just thinking now of the urban context. But there's also been major changes in the way that our rural and island communities function and their ability to function through things like digital connectivity. So change has become something that is a hallmark of our generation, if you like, and being able to manage and handle change is something that we need to think about. So making change acceptable is a skill and an art in itself, and it's not always easy, and not everybody will agree that a particular change is right. We say in the UK, you cannot please all people all of the time, and it's absolutely true. But what we need to do is work as hard as we can to make change as good as it can be for as many people as possible. And that is a constant endeavor, and it doesn't mean choosing a solution and then just driving it through. It means adapting and altering your strategy as you go along to achieve that good outcome. And as I said, I'm really optimistic or more optimistic than I have been. And a part of that is actually out of this crisis that we've been through with COVID. Because what that's shown me is that across the world, as citizens of the world, we can set ourselves a common endeavor and basically totally change our lives to meet a common goal. And we've never been able to do that before. So let's take some heart that we can do that. Now what we need to do is to get the information out there to show people, as we've done with COVID, what the threat is with climate change, how it affects their lives, how it affects our lives, basically, because we're part of this, and what responses we can take to make a contribution to that, and what we should expect of our businesses and governments to respond to that as well. And I think that if you'd asked any of us to sit down a year and a half ago and say what we thought might be possible, I think our list would not have got very far down what has happened in the world. So basically what's happened is quite unthinkable, but it's led to us then resetting the bar of what is possible. And so we need to take that on board. And if we think about translating that ability to change into our own personal relationship with energy, we've been doing work on the Reflex project to look at how do we as individual people and businesses place a value on energy. So every single person and enterprise has a relationship with energy, and we each make decisions many times a day about how we're going to pay and what type of energy we use. And some of those decisions are around monetary values. You make choices about where you'll go and get your gasoline for your scooter or your car, or you make a choice about whether you go on public transport. And although there's a mobility side to that, there's an energy side to that as well. We also make judgments about technical value in terms of the reliability of our energy systems and the availability of it. And we may also make decisions, what we call on softer issues about, well, who's providing the energy? Is it part of a community scheme? Are we going to support our community activity? Is it locally sourced energy, and what impact does that supply of energy have on our environment. And there are increasing numbers of people who are making judgments about energy in terms of the overall sustainability of that supply. Now, it doesn't mean that all of us are acting as one. We don't all make the same judgments in these areas, but all of us have to make judgments. And so what we need to think about is, as we change the energy system, we need to give information to us as customers in each of these areas, which help us make decisions that are good and aligned with transition and change, and we don't become obstacles to that. So in the context of our daily lives, as I say, we're influenced by choices about mobility solutions, about domestic cooking solutions, about air conditioning, and about travel. And these are the kind of things that we need to get into our heads, that these are energy decisions as well as the other aspects of decision making. So thank you for that. I hope that started to help you think about how our lives and the structures that we create politically interact with energy, and set us up to maybe start thinking in future topics about the opportunities there are for Indonesia, not just to follow best practice, but to leapfrog ahead and create best practice in the future. So, terima kasih. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gareth, for that. Ms. Sandra, would you kindly pull up the poll after this, please? And we can take some questions from participants and any comments, whether through chat boxes or directly. That's perfect. Thank you. So yes, it would be great if all participants can help participate in this poll, please. So there are some reference questions to the existing policy instruments in the UK, and then what you think of those policy instruments, and whether the suitability within Indonesia, whether there's a correlation there or not. And the third question will be around the what needs to be thought of when thinking, planning locally for a renewable energy system. So I see some of you already responded, so that's great. Do you have any comments or questions on Gareth material just now? Gareth, what is your opinion on having community energy to drive renewable energy in Indonesia?
Yeah, so I'm a great fan and supporter of community energy. I think that communities are going to be really important in our future social structure, and we've lived in the last century through an era where basically cities and urbanization and centralization and incorporation, actually, in terms of businesses, was the theme. So it was about getting things aggregated together into masses and dealing with mass activity. But I think that what we've seen through that process is that it makes it vulnerable to issues around natural disasters. It makes it vulnerable to some social pressures. It makes it vulnerable to certain people to take control of certain parts of a system to the detriment of many people. And so if we look at the SDGs as a worldwide basis for a more sustainable way of living, they require us to look at decentralization and empowerment of more people in our lives and in our systems. And so I think community energy can be an important part of that. And I think that will then strengthen the more centralized part. We need central elements for certain parts of our lives, but I think redressing the balance and getting a greater level of input from individual communities and parts of communities is really important. And that will come onto this a little bit more, but under the umbrella of the SDGs, there's also the issues around social inclusion and gender equality, and the participation of all parts of society in our future. And I think that renewable energy because of its geographical diversity, but also because of its nature of being slightly smaller scale than other forms of energy generation. And because it's new, it means that we can create the renewable sector in the vision of the world we have for today and tomorrow, and not necessarily in the view of the world that there was in the past, where coal and oil really grew up, in a social and industrial structure that was established in the 1800s and in the 20th century, whereas renewables is something that we can create for the 21st century.
Thanks for that, Gareth. I think it's worth actually coming from the point that you've just made there. So we have multiple discussions previous of the training and currently, but we keep coming back to this particular area that, how is it or what are the approaches, that I know that we have gone through them in separate of our presentations, but I think it's good to come back to this as well if once we arrive at this point. So how is it to introduce new technology, potentially new technology or systems, into energy actors and stakeholders, and how do you facilitate that acceptance of adoption? In a particular case example, if that needs to be, or in a broader general response, yeah. Gareth?
I think what we need to be aware of is that the conversation changes on a monthly and certainly a yearly basis. So when you and I started on this conversation, maybe 7-8 years ago, the reality was that renewable energy was in a different place than it is today. So we were trying to talk about technologies that maybe were just emerging to commerciality, and they were starting to be rolled out, and it looked as though they were going to be successful, but there wasn't necessarily a whole raft of evidence. But actually over that last 7 or 8 years, amazing things have happened. The amount of capacity has increased, probably getting on for tenfold in terms of how much technology is being deployed. And so we have a lived experience which is that much better. And at the same time, the price of technology and its effectiveness and reliability have improved as well. So the proposition is now more proven, and it's a better proposition. And that trend will continue. So I think that the really exciting thing for Indonesia is that there's more and more pilot scale demonstrate. You have to have a first project in any field or a first deployment to start to make progress. And then the important momentum is in the second, third, fourth, maybe the fifth deployment. But once you get to 5, maybe 10 deployments of a technology, either by then you'll know it doesn't work in the context that you're trying to put it in and it will stop. But if you've got to the 10th, it's already going to be successful. You're on a pathway to success. So I think how does that happen? It's about being consistent and determined across a group of people. Basically, it's about people making change, and you need champions within a country or within a community, within a business, who are going to drive that change. But then they need the tools to be able to call upon. So, in the history of the world, there's never been a better time to promote transition and renewables. So what we need now are the champions, and we've got 92 of them on the line at the moment, hopefully, who can go out in Indonesia and actually make this change happen, because it's going to be people that drive this with the assistance of technology.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Gareth. And I've had a comment as well in the chat box that we do in Indonesia have the Renewable Energy Society. So I'm guessing that is the message would be that should be part of that communication and stakeholder engagement process, which METI has put forward and perform its function. So I'm sure we've come across the discussions between UK and Indonesia around METI as well, and it would be great to be able to share this process stronger with the community of practice. So the other question.
Just one point, Neil, on that.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, I was actually thinking about that last night. that we hadn't touched on that, if you like, the engagement organizations. And
Yeah.
as is pointed out, it's great to have a national level organization, but one of the strengths that's happened in the UK is we've started to see regional and then community level organizations coming into this sphere of carbon transition. So it's great, and we've met a number of these organizations, but they are absolutely key to the success because they're the places where people can go to get organized and to help stimulate the transition in an accelerated way.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Gareth. I think we still have time. So there's this other question. Could I ask the translator to translate for this one, please, for Gareth? Sekarang ini banyak sekali beredar alat-alat murah terkait teknologi, dari alat elektronik, solar panel, wind turbine, bahkan transformers. Bagaimana England, is this specifically for England, I suppose the question, but we can maybe also include the UK as a whole. Bagaimana England menyikapi masifnya barang-barang murah ini tersedia dan masuk ke negara UK? Apakah ada regulasi tertentu yang membatasi dalam rangka melindungi konsumen? Is that okay, Gareth? Did you get the question okay?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think, as I mentioned, that when you start to make purchasing decisions, price, reliability, and actually origin of technology become quite important issues in certain contexts. So, as you know, in Indonesia, it's great when you can go and buy an Indonesian product, and it's the same for us in the UK. So, if we can buy from the UK, people will tend to do that until or unless it's too expensive compared to the competition, if you like. And then it's a judgment about is that cheaper technology better in terms of, or at least as good in terms of quality and reliability. And I think we see this in every walk of our lives in terms of whether it's a mobile phone, a TV, a car, whatever it is. So it's the same in energy. So we have seen an increase in the availability of lower cost technologies. Interestingly, one of the ones that's probably come down fastest, and if in its modularity it has greater spread, is probably around solar panels. And I think places like China have had an incredibly positive influence on the price of solar panels to bring them down, but other places as well. But there have also been issues around reliability and quality. An area that the UK is focused on perhaps a bit more is on small micro wind turbines. And most of those that are deployed in the UK have come from the UK or Europe, from France or Germany. So there's been less influence from other parts of the world there. We also have heat pump technology, which has become much more widely adopted, and storage heaters and water tanks that are more efficient in people's homes. So all of these individual technologies, and electric vehicles is another example. So all of these tools are things that are becoming much more established in the marketplace, and I think you will increasingly see either shops that focus on low energy goods, or that existing outlets will have low energy alternatives available. And but yeah, in terms of the regulation of those and the control of quality, we have quite strong consumer protection laws which apply to any product in the UK, and there is not any special consideration for renewables related or decarbonisation technology, but it's just expected to meet the same standards that other products are expected to meet.
Thanks, Gareth. I think that comprehensively answered all of the three parts of the questions. I think we'll make time for this question because I think it's a good question to put through, and it will open up further discussions as well with colleagues that are present today. I know we can't cover everything in the sessions, but hopefully this will be the first of many future interactions. So this one is about how to go quickly for energy transition in Indonesia, like the UK had. Well, there's also a quickly you might have a different take on quickly on that as well, Gareth. But yes, do we have to change our structure from a vertically integrated to competitive market? That was the question.
Yeah, so I just taking a deep breath now and thinking about how we get started this.
Be nice, Gareth.
One of the most difficult things to do is to change a structured market. So when you have a centralized market, to actually change the market itself is one of the most difficult things to do, because there's a degree of inertia in the people that are associated with the current market. So what we've seen in the UK is probably greatest pace of change in new markets that don't exist. And we have had the opportunity, for example, with offshore wind, where it became almost a new form of energy that nobody had a footprint in, and so that was able to grow quite quickly. But what has also happened is that we've been able to come from a bottom up, or nibble from the outside into the energy market. So we found ways of adding new capacity in and around the regulated market, and then as that's been able to prove itself at small scale, pilot scale if you like, then there's been greater momentum to bring that into the center. So it's been quite a gradual process, but I'm going to think back to what I said earlier, is that we're not necessarily going to follow the processes that we've taken to get to where we are today when we go tomorrow, because the pace of change that we need and the scale of change that's required, and it's not a question, I'll come back to this again later, it's not a question of if change is going to happen, it will happen. And it will either happen through a managed process or it'll happen through a terrible, terrible crisis, but change will happen. So our job, I think, in our professional lives is to try and make sure that that managed change is as progressive as possible. And so things like regionalization in a country as huge as Indonesia and as diverse as Indonesia, it isn't going to be a one solution that fits all. You basically need solutions that are appropriate for each of the islands, and each of the regencies and each of the parts of Indonesia, that then link together in a sensible way. And this is where renewables really helps us, because it doesn't actually always need a centralized solution. At times, you just need to free up and empower people in the various parts of Indonesia to find their own solutions. So I think that empowerment of, it comes back to the point made earlier about renewables can strengthen social community structures in a way that other things haven't done recently. And there can be great benefits from that, I think, if we plan to take the good things and leave the bad things behind. So I think that to achieve the rapidity of it, the important thing is to mobilize the collective ambition. But then, and this may seem almost an opposite point, is that, and you go back to the COVID situation, what we were so successful about there is governments actually told us as citizens what we were allowed to do and what we weren't allowed to do. And of course, most of us followed those rules. So there is a lesson there that if you actually want to get transformational change immediately, which is what happened within the space of a month, basically, most countries totally transformed their social structure, then government needs to be brave and tell us what we need to do. But if you then have that supported, that centralized instruction is supported by regional social structures, then that will be that much greater success and sustainable.
Thanks very much, Gareth. Ms. Sandra, can we close the poll and have the results, please, before we move on to the next topic? Thank you very much. So hopefully everybody can see that. This is the table which Gareth has kindly dropped some hints on. So between the policy instruments below, which ones do you think give the highest growth in electricity from renewable energy in the UK? Most of you think it's NFFO, and followed by RFTO. For the second questions around the policy instruments that have been implemented in the UK, which ones do you think would or probably would be relevant to be implemented in Indonesia? So most of you think that it is the FITs, feed-in tariffs, and followed by the ROCs, renewables obligation certificates. Oh, sorry, the highest is actually Community Renewable Energy Scheme. Sorry, my fault. That's the highest answer from people attending this forum. The Community and Renewable Energy Scheme is thought to be the highest answer. For number 3, the elements that needs to be considered in the local planning system. So almost everybody, well, 42% agrees that it's the benefits that can be generated from the generators and the potential for replication in other markets. So that is the results of the poll. Thank you, Ms. Sandra. And can we go to the next slide, please? That's perfect. So for this next topic, I'll be speaking myself. So hopefully, if you have any questions or comments, please do put them in the chat box. We'll collectively try to capture them as we go. Also, I'd like to set a reminder that for all participants to also register in their in the form so that it can be captured to build into your certificate of completions. That would be greatly appreciated. And moving on to the next slide, please, Ms. Sandra. And in this topic, I'll hopefully cover a range of the options that we may look into to how we could leapfrog in energy transition, finding the information and available knowledge shared between both inside Indonesia and also externally from Indonesia, and how we can move forwards in that. So I'll now share my screen. And hopefully we could go into the first slide. Can I check that everybody could see the screen now? Sandra, can I have a confirmation, please?
Yes, we
Thank
can
you.
see it.
Thanks very much. Okay, so again, we're going to look at briefly how to leapfrog in energy transition and what the opportunities are for Indonesia. Now, we have, having heard from the last few speakers over the past couple of days, and we've had this great wealth of information both from the Indonesia and in the UK experience. I think it's a good time to try and look at what we could do with those information and how it could assist in the forward-looking pathway. For this topic, I'll make a start in introducing those options and what we could do with those options. And throughout, I will invite Gareth's input in some of the processes to share his lived-in experience. So if we first take a look at this, I'd like to bring everybody to this space that we understand as a leapfrog method. So from our discussions this last 3 days, we have come to this conversations about it is a long way and sometimes difficult, more difficult than others, some are easy, but it is quite a significant journey from creating the vision up to replication. So, and these steps between vision and replication are not necessarily symmetrical like the ones that I just put there on the screen. It's just because I like symmetry, that's why. But the steps towards replication, each of these steps, sometimes some are more steeper than others, some are more slippery than others. And what we need to remember is taking a step up might sometimes mean that we need to take 2 steps, 3 steps backwards. And so the iteration goes until we get things right. Now, some of the example opportunities that we have maybe is that we can skip a few steps, perhaps, and as an example, between conceptualization to pilots. Another room example is maybe we could skip a few steps between finding some resolutions to conflict that are found after conducting pilots, whether that's technical, environmental, social, or political potential conflicts that we've discovered, and jump straight to the adoption adaptation process. And that might get us to where we want to be without having to actually repeat the same mistakes, perhaps. So, but the first thing is, which is key, I think, is how do we spot good practice? So the ability to spot good practice so that it enables us to make that decision whether we can jump ahead. So what is considered as good practice? It is a practice that has been proven to work well and produce good results. So that's one of the key criteria, that it needs to work, it needs to deliver its objective and produce good results for the benefits of the users. And therefore, it is recommended as a model. It's also a successful experience, which has been tested and validated in the broad sense and has been repeated to a degree. So it deserves to be shared with others so that greater number of people can benefit. Now, some might prefer to use the term best practice, and this sometimes is used interchangeably, but it's always debatable whether there is a single best practice, which it implies, or there are multiple good practices that applies to different situations. And those approaches are constantly evolving and being updated throughout. The next part, after we understand what might be good, what might be considered as good practice. So how do we know if what we see is good practice? This is where the sets of criteria that have been developed might be useful to identify and enable us to decide whether what we see is good practice or not. So the first one is good practice needs to be effective and successful. Coming back to its definition, it needs to serve its purpose. Good practice needs to deliver its objective and bring good results to the intended beneficiaries. A good practice should be environmentally, economically, and socially sustainable. So it needs to meet the needs of the present, and with specific reference as well to the needs of the most vulnerable and the weakest, as well as the average and the strongest. And it needs to work for the present, but also works in the future. A good practice should also be gender sensitive and socially inclusive. And that's where it is important to see how the different actors of different genders, of different social background, take part in the initiative and also can make their situations better or have an improved situation by being involved in the practice. And when speaking about JESI, you know, it's not just about gender. So I think it's important to remember that there are different groups of social background as well that we need to take into account. And this might include those that are in different age groups. And then it might be also, for example, older workforce when we're speaking about transition. And also for some cases, especially in post-conflict and post-disaster communities, internally displaced people, they will have their own separate criteria. So that is the third criteria of a good practice. The next one is a good practice needs to be technically feasible, and that is the basis of a good practice so that it can be replicated in different situations with modifications. A good practice is inherently participatory, so it invites, the methods used needs to invite participation from the different actors, from different genders, different social backgrounds into the process so that the planning and also the delivery is inclusive of this diversity. And finally, it needs to reduce disaster crisis risk if there are any and if applicable. Now, how do we identify good practice? There are many ways of doing this. So one of them might be to get in touch with the individuals or the groups of individuals who have delivered excellent results. And because somewhere in there, there's the good practice. And the next step is to look and discern at those activities that they have delivered, and spot and try and identify where within those the good practice lie. But there are many other ways of doing that as well. There's the community of practice. There are in smaller degree exit interviews, for example. But the main thing to remember is that no one has done it all right, especially not the first times. And also, no one else's solutions are perfect for anyone else's situations. So therefore, I think Gareth has repeated this message quite a lot as well. So we need to learn and adapt rather than following. And people who have shared what has gone wrong might be more useful than promoting what has gone right in the occasions. And just as before we entering this topic, Gareth has touched on that yesterday's solution and successes might not be effective in today and tomorrow's world. And again, repeating what Gareth has indicated, that the scale and pace of the change needed is unprecedented. So what are the benefits of identifying and sharing good practice? You can see from here, there's a range of the benefits from identifying and sharing good practice. But I think some of the main ones are, one, we need to, if the good practice is not identified and shared, then there's a risk that mistakes will likely happen again, repeated mistakes. There's also a chance that the good results and the good achievements are forgotten over time. And the greatest risk as well is that the chance to provide improvement in certain practices might just be lost. So where do we find good practice? We should always look locally as well as elsewhere, and that needs to be proven in practice and have been used in a number of places, similar places. And it takes perspectives from different stakeholders. So if we take an example back from the narratives that Gaynor put forward in the first day, where she took examples of work undertaken in Takabonerate and in Aceh, the way the good practice is already embedded within those local communities, in the local wisdom, in the indigenous wisdom contained within those communities. And what I think came very strongly in our interactions there, the good practice relates to sustainable resources management as well as social inclusion. And what we brought from elsewhere is actually just a little bit around the renewable energy knowledge and experience, and the combination of input actually allowed us to leapfrog in those situations. So that is an example of combining local and elsewhere. Now, also, this is quite important to put forward, is that we need to avoid winner takes all scenarios. Sharing opportunities is so much better. Hence, the collaborative perspective needs to be embedded in finding good practice. So that ethos of looking for ways to collaborate, I think that influences where we could find good practice. Next is about securing access to those good practice. Once we found them, we know how to locate them. How do we secure access to those good practices? Whether the practices that we want to get access to are local good practice or elsewhere good practice, it's actually similar in the way that we could try and secure the access to. So it's basically just coming with good intentions, with integrity, I would say. That would be the main means of getting access to these good practices, which then brings us to the importance of trust and mutual respect of all the actors involved in the knowledge sharing. And that's where creating aligned incentives becomes easier, because when we have shared trust and mutual respect, sharing information, create alliances is easy. We need to be clear about the foreground and background IP, if there are such considerations, and how each will be respected and rewarded equally. There's also a need to consider where to build local and how to build local capacity. And there's a discussion that needs to take place around what will work best for the local needs and aspirations. I won't go into too much details on this slides because I know that throughout the previous few days, we've covered quite a lot of this already from different examples. Definitely the smart local energy system. I think that was John and Mark have touched on that. And Ian actually. So innovative business model and customer engagement strategies through Ian J's presentation and also Mark earlier in the day, and the R&D role in energy transition. That's the ABCG driven collaboration that Gareth and Gaynor has pointed out. What I would like to get your thoughts and attention to is actually the social dimension of the energy transition. Now, I'm not sure we have enough time today to go through in detail of each of the different steps here, but as an example for the local smart grid, you will have this slide and you can look in your own time how these bridges are built. But basically, throughout the different technical and social perspectives of pre-intervention, intervention, and post-intervention, there are the social and technical bridges that are built. So if you see those arrows linking the different matrices of different technical and social practices, that is where those causal effects are built in. Now that we know what good practice is, we can tell the difference between the good practice and the not so good practice. We know where to look for them, and we know how to secure access to good practice. So what do we do with those information? Acting on it first requires documenting these good practices. And the act of documenting is actually a little bit more complicated than just reporting, because it requires an immersion of whoever is involved to understand the knowledge that's being shared. So we will speak a little bit later about the different types of knowledge, but documenting the good practice requires the ability to capture the knowledge, not just the explicit knowledge, but also the tacit knowledge behind that. Hence, immersion is very much in the process. Just to give a very quick example on that, the work throughout Takabonerate, Mas Agung is here. So Agung have spent a long time spending with the communities in Takabonerate for years, interacting with stakeholders, and that's when the knowledge exchange takes place, to a point where he can invite and introduce good practices externally, and also take the good practice locally and exchange that with the external information. Likewise, in Aceh, again, coming back to the examples that Gaynor provided, I was in Aceh since just before the peace resolution and just until almost towards the end of the rehabilitation. So it takes multiple years of interactions and being immersed in the community to be able to meet the 2 points. And I'm sure, colleagues from Mentari here that have been working in Sumba and from the ministry as well for a number of years, that is where the good practice can actually come out. So, and going back to documenting this good practice, there are certain aspects that needs to be documented specifically. Of course, the geographical coverage, but also the actors, stakeholders, and target beneficiaries. There needs to be a disaggregated data set collected here so that we can monitor the gender equality and social inclusion, GESI, implications, monitoring, analysis, and also evaluation in the process. When we look at the context and objective, we need to be clear of what it is that we are taking in as the good examples, the methodological approach, tools and techniques that can be used in other places. If the methods are sound, you can actually replicate that easier in other places with different situations, going back to those key tools and techniques. And again, results and impact, success factors, we need to look at them in a disaggregated way so that it's clear what benefits does each group or actors obtain from certain good practice. Having captured that good practice, what do? We need to disseminate and share. So databases are useful, the documentations are useful, but it's the sharing that creates the added value. So sharing can be done through so many different ways. Again, communities of practice, groups of people believing in the same vision and moving towards the pathway together. organized learning events, just like what we're doing just now. Secondments, putting certain individuals inside other organizations to embrace the organizational culture and also take that forward into different pathways. Visits to high performers, again, seeing is believing. So we have had people in the virtual visit to Orkney, for example, and also in person, seeing how the renewable energy generation in Orkney takes place and the interactions between the stakeholders in Orkney performs. There's also quality circles and talent exchanges, and I have to say the Mantari work has so far tried to capture this different means of sharing good practices, and hopefully this will continue as well in the future. Sharing means that we have to implement it. So how do we implement the shared good practice? Development of supporting infrastructure is needed. So what is needed as a supporting infrastructure? In that case, people is definitely the baseline of, we need to, is the primary driver of the supporting infrastructure. It's people that drive the process, taking the initial ideas into embedded practice, and it takes years and perhaps repeated work to and overcome cycles of roles and leadership. So the key is the people that have that drive to just stick on it and work on it all the time. Bad, worse, good, better, work through that until the initial idea is embedded in practice. There's also the technical infrastructure around document sharing and database support that we need to have, as well as the classification and digitalization process as a content management infrastructure at a more practical level. Just quickly on the do's and don'ts. So we need to remember that good practice evolves constantly. We need to tie good practices to drivers, focused on those that add values, and recognize the individuals and groups who submit those good practices, promote this practice resource actively, and also monitor the use of good practice and make contact to the providers to make the sharing easy. What's important is we should not treat good practice as a quick fix, and setting up the required process can be resource intensive. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of organizational culture. I think we come to this aspect repeatedly as well, and we need to avoid to give. We need to not give in to the temptation to focus on explicit knowledge. It is definitely through the people that deep knowledge is transferred. And don't be too prescriptive about good practices. So focus instead on actually encouraging the people to identify and share them voluntarily. Sandra or Henny, can I double check about time, please? How long do we have?
10 minutes left.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So in avoiding pitfalls, I'll go and perhaps invite Gareth to speak about some of the mistakes and pitfalls that have been identified around delayed transition, misplaced investment, losing first mover advantage, or ecological, new ecological impact, social, economic, and poor outcomes. So Gareth, would you like to come in on the pitfall examples from the UK, perhaps?
Yes. So it feels, it's like we have this kind of in the TV entertainment industry, the good cop, bad cop routine. So Nia's told you about all the good things, and I'm going to come in and tell you about all the bad things. So I'm the bad cop.
That's the plan, Gareth.
But yeah, there is a serious side to this, obviously, and the list here is hopefully interesting to you. I won't necessarily speak about each individual one, but I think that one of the things to understand is that the world is not a perfect place, and the transition that has happened has come. It's been hard earned. We've taken a lot of the good things, but there have been some not so good things along the way, and those things follow politics. They follow technical issues, they follow business issues, they follow community issues. So all parts of society, whether it's the top people or the middle or the bottom people, contribute to this in good and bad ways. So the key things I think out of this are the consistency of policy development is really helpful, and I've mentioned this I think in day one. And we need to make sure, therefore, that the targets that we're addressing are bold enough, that the ambition is strong enough, and this is even more important now. I know there's dates around 2060, 2050. In Scotland, we're 2045, and I said in Orkney, we're 2030. There's no reason why a part of Indonesia couldn't set itself an early transition target and become a focus for that. And that might be an island, it might be an urban community. So we need to be bold, and we need to localize those targets, not just deal with them at a national level. And I think the other part is making sure that there's, just before we go to the next one here, just make sure that there's something in it for everybody. We need to make sure that the local agenda is addressed, and that people have the opportunity to contribute to and benefit from this transition. And that isn't going to come by just making cost rule. It has to be a more balanced approach. Okay, next one. And so in terms of the alignment of policies, we need to think in a balanced way about all parts of our energy system. There has been a focus on electricity, frankly, because that was the first and the easiest one for us to target collectively in the world. But that was in the last 20 years. So in the next 20 years, we have to think about all parts of our energy system at the same time. And although it's something that people say that all of the technologies that we need to affect this transition are probably available to us now, so we don't actually need to invent anything. What we maybe need to do is to make things cheaper and more effective, and apply them. That's the key challenge. So, but applying technology is as much R&D as is inventing it. So we need to make sure that there's a balance there. Okay, the next one, please. So the key message with all of these difficulties are that all mistakes and challenges are learning opportunities. And they say that, anybody can make one mistake. It's the not so clever people that make two mistakes of the same type, and you just become stupid if you make the same mistake 3 times. So we need to learn and make sure we don't repeat those mistakes. So we need to be inquisitive, not only about the successes, but we need to ask about the failures, and we need to own the failures. I've done things, and we've all done things in our lives which have not been so good, and we need to be able to speak about those. And one of the ways that's perhaps good is to ask a very simple question about things, which is why. And it's something that I learned from some other people about. If you ask the question why 5 times for an issue, you usually get to the absolute core of why something's gone wrong. But even asking a question why once is usually illuminating in terms of any issue that's arisen. And that allows you to take account of different perspectives, and by going through that sequence, you'll probably find that there's internal and external factors, and you need to join all of those together to make it work. But as I come back to the point that the question is not about whether we're going to make change happen. It's all about how do we best make change happen, because there is no future without change. I think I'm giving back to you now, Nia. Is that right?
Yes, thanks very much, Gareth. So again, just moving on from Gareth's last point, how do we respond to this pitfalls, lessons learned? I think one of the areas of discussion should be about the convergence of these change agents' viewpoints, and this is especially true when we're dealing with local good practices and external good practices meeting, or the different agents of change meeting in the same space. Taking an example of the UK and Indonesia, this is a lived-in experience for me. Gareth and colleagues at work as well, that comes from different nationalities. At home, in my personal life, my husband's Scottish, all of my boys have been raised here. So this is a East meets West situation that can that it's inevitable in our conversation, especially when we are coming together in contributing to solving a particular problem. So in terms of the diversity of Indonesia, there is, of course, the multi-level governance aspect and cultural leadership. But when we start to see the dynamic when that meets the other cultures and organizational or geographical cultures, is about language hierarchy, the gestures, perceptions, and biases involved in communicating these different knowledges, and also the different ways of people dealing with uncertainty, being proactive or reactive, and taking initiative over versus overpowering, and balancing the subtlety and clarity as well as lateral decision making. What I want to highlight a little bit in between these diversity and dynamic lies the perceptions and perceived barriers or perceived drivers that different people have. And Jesse very much comes into place in here, because it's very important for us to acknowledge the different perceptions coming from the different genders and the different social background. And that needs to be fed into any action planning or in the delivery so that it's fit for purpose and inclusive. The other aspect to that is that we are also influenced very much by our surroundings, our social environment and our natural environment, in how we see differences in people's backgrounds, in social backgrounds, or even in different genders. And we need to acknowledge those biases in the process, but also making conscious decision and conscious actions to make sure that these biases does not or does not exclude any particular grouping advertently. There's a little bit about unintended consequences, and the ones listed here are more on the national and perhaps regional level, around creating a just transition for all, transitioning energy resources, supply and demand, and also managing energy exports and national use. And this is related to creating or managing spaces for the different types of renewables, as well as, like we have discussed in the previous topic, around seeking areas for competitive advantages between whether that's local, regional, national, or wider levels. A more practical example, perhaps, it comes through in so many simple, or what we thought would be simple, is, for example, when you're choosing a site for a pilot or for an action research project, how do you choose, between one site to another? Of course, the logical technological considerations, financing, and social stakeholder interactions, this dictates quite a lot of that. But how do we make that decision that our selection does not exclude the rest or the people living in the boundaries of our area? And that, the very thing, this is from different instances that we've gone through ourselves as well, from that choice, the very thing that we're trying to avoid in the first place, which is conflict based on inequality of resources, is actually reintroduced through this activity. That I think is one of an example of unintended consequences of what we do. And just as the last part, I know I'm conscious that we are over time. This is the last part of this topic, is we need to create effective interfaces and bridges. Well, first of all, definitely looking at the bigger picture. What's the point in doing all of this? Why do we do this? Is to address these global challenges of the common global challenges that every country faces: food security, energy sovereignty, and clean water availability. And how do we get that across into a transformative and high impact solutions? Alleviating poverty, disaster mitigation, conflict resolution, and climate change actually is the very one of the main drivers for many of those areas. So again, the international expertise, nationwide experience, and local knowledge is determinant in taking this challenge into an implementation strategy. And that takes a lot of multidisciplinary approach and also considerations on appropriate technology to be able to create this link through capacity building and technical assistance. And that's where the grounded policy recommendation can come in, and also the suggestion for local business incubation. And in there contain the different aspects that have to that we need to be aware of. The second pathway that we need to look at is probably taking pilots to mainstreams. Again, this has been discussed before. Documenting successes as well as good results is as important to take the learning from what happened to the mainstream, and also having a visible demonstration of integrated system is what we're looking for, because seeing is believing. And through the different strands of Mentari, I think we are actually delivering these combinations of activities and trying to get into a practical space from what is the original conceptualization area. So this is where I thought the ABCG communications within the stakeholder groups becomes important, as well as extending that communication out with the ABCG network. And then that can relate from between local actors to other communities, and that's the rollout process. Just as an example, one of the pathways that we have followed through is the step changes of building sustainable energy for coastal communities. It started way back in 2011, 2012, I would say, and that is around providing the capacity building structure and technical assistance in the different areas. And the reason I put this forward is because I think it gives an example of the UK and Indonesia collaboration in each of the steps that we take forward and the output that we have taken through and built on as we go. So if you see from the initial stages in the capacity building, it started with people-to-people partnership, moving on to grouping partnerships, and then institutional partnerships, moving then finally to institutional development, where we work in practice with the stakeholders locally. In the technical assistance, as you would all might be aware, scoping the initial problems and situations, conducting feasibility studies, planning, as well as finally in the area of trying to establish this supporting center of excellence to obtain that, to provide that platform of collaboration. And this comes to a spur of burst of activities this last couple of years, and we have that living example of researchers undergoing at the same time the PhDs in materials adaptation, financing schemes for Eastern Indonesia, as well as the different other transfer mechanism as what we're undertaking, the different trainings as well as inwards mission. So the next example of the pathways is on coal phase out. Gareth, do you want to quickly say a couple of words or a few minutes on this, maybe?
Yeah, I think what I'm going to... Oh, hold on. Oh, am I unmuted? Yeah, okay, I'm back. Yeah, I think what I'm going to do is just say that this outlines the process that would need to perhaps be followed around coal phase out. A lot of the details have been discussed earlier. It's a way, it's not the way, if you like, so that would need to be addressed. All of the best practice that Nia said, engaging with stakeholders, working out how best to do it, needs to apply. So you can't have a kind of ready, prepared solution. You need to work through this, but it is something that needs to be addressed, and one of a number. And if you go to the next one, it's around perhaps the case for public transport. As we said, transport is one of the greatest challenges that we have to overcome, and the solution in Indonesia, and indeed in the different parts of Indonesia, are going to be unique. There's parts of Indonesia that use boats for 100% of their transport. There's other parts that use scooters and vehicles. So not everywhere has a train or a bus service. So we need to think about all of those geographical differences. And again, this is a pathway, but it needs to apply all of the practices that Nia's outlined to establish what is the pathway that perhaps needs to be done on a regional or community level to get to a good outcome. That's all I'll say.
Thanks, Gareth. I'll skip this one as you'll have that in your PowerPoint, and I think this comes to my last two slides actually, just to iterate that when we are converting wider experience to local successes, we need to be aware of the knowledge systems that we're interacting with. So there are two groups of knowledge systems. There's the explicit knowledge, which has data, information, documentation, records, files, but that is only 5% of the whole knowledge system. The larger wider knowledge base is actually what we call as tacit knowledge, and that is experience, thinking, competence, commitment, deed. So that is something that we don't often see in material. And when we do convert these into local successes, means that we need some bidirectional interactions and knowledge exchanges depending on the different type of knowledge system we're interacting with. So for explicit knowledge interactions, we need to find a way of externalizing, writing things down, creating metaphors, analogies, modeling like what we're doing just now. And also there's the tacit transfer of knowledge, which needs more on the socialization, sharing experience, observing, imitating, and brainstorming without criticism. And these two aspects here work jointly together. So when we have discussions like what we have in the last 3 days, it creates joint perspectives and perceptions, and we highlight loopholes in understandings. When we do have visits to established agencies, seeing is believing and getting shared understanding. And I think I'll stop here in the sustainable energy policy, because Gareth will touch on that a bit more on PowerPoint for topic 8b. And for this sustainable energy policy in practice, definitely it is about creating that encouragement for investment, and that's not just monetary, but also time and effort in public and private sectors, with a clear business case to any strategies, and deliver in a participatory, transparent, accountable way, especially when we talk about place-relevant policies, which Garth will talk about a lot more in his slides, and also JC-sensitive policies, which means that in the process of acquiring, in the policy formulation, we need to consciously include the JC expertise in the team so that we could absorb the lessons learned, the baseline materials around the policy documentation to capture these aspects specifically, as well as when we release the policy products, it's also tailored to the specific and different genders and social background. I'll stop sharing at that point, and I think the rest you could have in your shared folder after the session is completed. Over back to you, Masandra. Can we pull up the poll, please? And I'll take maybe just a couple of questions at this point, if any. If not, we can move on to the next topic. Apologies for that. Okay, so we have the polls on screen. We could try, and if I could ask participants to participate in this poll. And in the meantime, if you want to put any comments or questions in the chat box, please do. I'm going to ask maybe that the poll can be left open for another minute or two, and we can move on to the...
I'm happy to start here, and if you want to then...
yeah.
You can then tell them to cut the poll when... Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Gareth. That's so, Masandra, would you mind going to the next slide, please? This is for Gareth's topic. Good stuff. And so this last topic of the training will be delivered by Gareth. And if you could move on to the next slide, please, Masandra. We'll keep the polls running, so if you keep participating in that, that would be great. And I think I just had a reminder that for participants to fill in their registration forms, and also if you want to ask any questions, type it in the chat box. That would be great. Gareth, it will be you now on the role of energy systems modeling, target setting, and the relations to the key instruments and development and for change in Indonesia. I'd like to say as well at this point that we have colleagues from the embassy and also the policy team in Mentari. Please, because we know that this particular side of work is very much embedded into the Mentari program in Indonesia. Please jump in anytime for any comments, or if Gareth, you see anywhere relevant that we can invite them in, then we could just do that. Over to you, Gareth.
Thank you. Okay, I'll just share. Exit polling. Okay, so you should have the title screen, yeah? So we talked about the SDGs and GESI, and one of these things is that I think they're really important because they give us this overall social objectives and guiding principles. And in establishing a program of change, it's really important to have a common base that we can all reference and say, yes, that's where we're coming from. We might have differences or opinions about how to go from that base to where we're going to get to and the pathway and the actual end point. But it's really good to understand where we're at. And I think that the SDG framework not only gives a good basis on a national level, but also it allows for that international translation as well in a very effective way. But having talked about the commonality, what I'm also going to come back to is the diversity of community situations. And the pictures here just reflect, 6 of any number of communities that you could have in Indonesia. But it's recognizing that each community has its own situation, size, structure, wealth, capacity. All of these things define the uniqueness of a community. And I think one of the things that we try and do when working with countries or regions or communities is help people understand who is it or where can you find similarities, but also recognize the uniqueness and differences so you don't try and adopt something that's inappropriate. And obviously the solution that's needed in a fishing village that extends out into the sea is very different from when you're in the middle of Metro Jakarta. So part of the tools that we have available for this are looking at modeling. And modeling is important because it allows you to look at futures and alternatives in a kind of non-intrusive way, if you like. It allows you to explore options without actually changing people's lives, and in many cases without spending huge amounts of money. And therefore, through modeling, you can sometimes learn about challenges or obstacles or see opportunities and things that you want, which would have taken much longer to achieve without modeling. So an example of that, and I'm going to go through 3 levels, is resource modeling. So in renewable energy, it's incredibly important to understand where your resources are, the level of resources that are there, and their proximity to markets. And one of the realities is that if you have a large market, say like Jakarta, then it can pull energy from a large distance or a larger distance and still be cost effective because it can effectively pay for the linking infrastructure. But if you go to a small island with maybe a few hundred or thousands of people on that island, then the resource area that capacity of energy demand can draw from is much more localized. And so we need to think about the relationship between the resource availability and its scale and the market opportunities and their scale, and get those 2 things to coincide. And for the small markets, there'll be a small area of influence. For the larger markets, it will be larger scale. And this is where things like grids and energy transport come into play, because the grids can help join remoter and distant markets together. But of course, grid is not free. It comes at a cost. So we need to make a decision about when and where it's worth investing in those grids. And another thing to think about then is, once we understand the resources and the markets, is thinking about the technology fit. And I've just pulled this together as a very quick overview. And I'm not, again, this is a model, it's not the model. So this is looking at a lot of the technologies that we've talked about and looking at across these criteria on a simple scale, which ones score best and worst. And what this suggests, and it's not an answer, sorry, it's an answer, not the answer, is that those 2 solar sources, and in fact 3 solar sources, score very highly in terms of their suitability for development. Now that doesn't mean that they're exclusively the way to go, because in each situation there'll be different ranking system. So this, by nature of the fact this is one ranking system, it immediately suggests that this isn't all of the answers, it's just an indication. But this kind of model is something that can be used quite usefully, I think, to show applicability and to understand where and how different technologies or other solutions might be more or less applicable. Going beyond that, and this is an indication of some work that is being done in Europe at the present time, but we're also working on a model for Indonesia, or hoping to get a model established for Indonesia, and it's a process called Evolve, which is looking at the place, time and value associated with energy, and seeking to analyze that on a grid scale basis, so probably on a kilometer scale or a 250 meter scale basis across wide geographical areas. So the ambition of Evolve is to take some of that resource market technology modeling and to integrate that into one package and look at how different types of energy can be best delivered to the marketplace. And so that's the next level of modeling that perhaps can help inform decision making. And then you heard yesterday on Tuesday about some of the work that's being done in terms of market development and modeling. And so in Orkney, we've launched this Reflex organization to deliver energy to individual homes, to businesses, and as well as having the entity, the company, we effectively have a digital twin of that company, which is allowing us to explore how the company might behave and how the service might develop under different scenarios. So modeling can work at that endpoint of delivery, as well as in the system planning and as well as at the resource level. So it can help inform and explore scenarios on each of those levels. So the other area I wanted to touch on was target setting. And the main thing about targets is that, a bit like knowing where you're coming from with the SDGs and GESI, it helps you define where you're all going to, because people can say in the UK 2050 net zero, in Scotland 2045, in Orkney 2030. So it's really useful to have these points that everybody can point to and say, is what you're proposing going to meet that objective, that target? But for targets to be most useful, they need to be smart, and you can see here the elements that build up into that. Interestingly, as I reported, Scotland had this 100% of electrical demand target for 2020, and we missed it by 3%. We got to 97%. Now, there might be hard taskmasters amongst you that think that that's failure, but I think in Scotland we see 97% of achievement of a target as a success. So I don't think we should be afraid about setting ambitious targets, and if we fall slightly short of that, but we've shown a trajectory, we've made the effort, and we can show that we are going to get there, that isn't something that we should be too hard on ourselves about. It's much worse if you create a too cautious target and you slow progress down. So in terms of thinking then about how these elements of modeling and target setting could then help in the issues such as coal transition, it's interesting, I think, to think about the reality around that. And one of the issues is that the use of coal isn't a purely electrical issue. It's absolutely true that a lot of Indonesia's grid-connected electricity comes from coal, but there's a lot of Indonesia that's off-grid, and so that's a diesel question, which we'll come on to. And coal is used for industry, off-grid, and most of the coal in Indonesia produces is exported. And of course, the coal comes from coal mines, so it's a very important industrial activity in specific parts of Indonesia. So by addressing the role of coal in the electricity system, we actually have to address all of these other aspects of the coal economy if it's going to be a coherent strategy. And that magnifies the challenge, but it also perhaps suggests that you're not going to make a lot of progress around the use of coal for power generation unless and until we address all of these other challenges as well. But one of the reasons connected with that we might do that is the benefits that will come through that decarbonisation process. Because the solutions that replace coal are not without benefits. They have significant benefits in terms of jobs, employment, industrial stimulus, technology stimulus, social cohesion, environmental recovery, etc. So we need to think about all of those benefits. It's a different world, it's a changed world, but it's not necessarily a worse world. And the challenge of the target setting and the process of change management is to make sure that that's a managed transition and that it disadvantages as few people as possible and maximizes opportunity for as many people as possible. But yeah, the world is going to look different in the future. And I come back to this point, it's not a choice. We can't keep the old ways. That's kind of gone. It's about how we manage the transition to the new solution. And yesterday, we touched on the fact that if you start looking at the locations of where coal power stations are, and coal mines and coal transport and distribution points, then there are solutions that maybe start to emerge for each of these locations. And those solutions are different in the different locations. So we need to think about how we can match those two things together. Diesel is, as I mentioned, another consideration, and in many parts of Indonesia is the existing major source of energy. And interestingly, I think that the match-up between diesel and renewables is a slightly easier issue. And in part, that's because there's probably a more flexible supply chain and a greater degree of flexibility around diesel delivery than there is around coal. And that in part is in relation to the different scales at which diesel can operate. And if there is a diesel plant in a community or in an island at the present time, to be able to switch that diesel off for an increasing length of time saves fuel, which is the major cost at the moment, having bought the plant. And if you can replace that with renewables, then that's a win-win situation in many cases. And so retrofitting renewables alongside diesel plant, not just to replace it, but at the start to maybe cope with extra demand or produce a lower cost base for existing demand is something that's been increasingly adopted. And it's already happening in parts of Indonesia, and I'm sure that will accelerate in the future. And what's also interesting and important to understand is that, you know, a diesel engine is not so different from a vehicle engine. And so the mechanical engineering skills that are associated with diesel and vehicle transport, we need to think about how they can be added to create perhaps greater electrical system skills that will be associated with renewables and EVs and e-boats as well. So at the moment, you know, the reality is that diesel use is increasing, and we need to be able to model how that might transition over time. So it might be that in the short term, diesel use continues to increase, but we need to have a plan for how that can be abated and turned down as quickly as possible, and that renewables can be used to make their contribution. So targets are going to be key to this, and there's different ways that targets can be created. And I've put their directive. We could basically be told this is the outcome, make it happen. There could be monetary incentives created, carbon-based targets, a whole range of issues. Targets can also be geographically set up, and if you think about the competitive instincts that we have in our communities, think about some of the sports maybe where we follow our local teams, people can get bought into local community endeavor, and perhaps, you know, it's possible to create competitive spirit in the decarbonisation game. It's certainly something that's motivated Orkney. Orkney loves the fact that we're the first island in Scotland to be decarbonised, and we absolutely love the fact that we're further ahead than our neighbours in Shetland and the Western Isles, although we're very happy to bring them along to follow us. So, you know, competitive instincts can be really good in setting targets and achieving progress. So, thinking now about the instruments that exist to facilitate change, and we've just picked out two key elements here, which are the rune and the ruptal, and just thinking about as examples how these mechanisms might evolve and develop over time to embrace some of the principles that we've talked about in this previous sessions. So on the rune side, first of all, which looks at, you know, models to plan the energy future, you know, it's already set up as quite an integrated tool, looking at a breadth of issues within the energy system, and it looks at trends over time and the contribution that different elements of the energy system might make, and it already looks at different scenarios and how those scenarios might play out. But despite that and the detail that it is included around renewable outcomes, there are certain technologies that have been picked and their contribution has been mapped. But it's interesting when you think about the diversity of outcomes and the range of possibilities, and this is true of any plan in the world. Very often, as here, we produce a single number outcome. So we're saying, for example, that you know, by in 2025, there's certain amounts of mini or micro hydro that are going to be produced, or in 2050, there's certain amounts of solar power that are going to exist. Now, what we need to remember is that these numbers may be high estimates, mid estimates, or low estimates of a range of outcomes that could arise. And so in any of these plans, any number indicates a distribution of outcomes or alternative outcomes below that. And this can be seen perhaps, an example here is of the tipping point and crossover points for fuel and electricity consumption in terms of vehicles. And, you know, the business as usual trajectory is shown in the dotted line. And within the rune, it looks at the role that electrification might have in terms of reaching a point perhaps by 2050 where, you know, electric vehicle use is matching combustion engine use. But of course, that transition could happen earlier if the right stimulus is included. So we need to think about that and make decisions which adapt to the changes in availability of technology, the appetite of drivers to change what they're using, and the imperative of, for example, air quality as well as carbon abatement on that journey. So if we think about the rune, there probably are areas where it could be adapted to consider perhaps more about the context of change that's happening. So what are the changes in technology availability and cost globally? And we touched on that in one of the previous questions. What are the changes in energy markets? So if the export market for coal and oil change markedly, how does that change Indonesia's ability to produce and use coal domestically? There may be changes in customer and consumer behavior nationally and internationally. Things that are currently accepted and part of our consumer mix might become unacceptable if they have too high a carbon tariff associated with them. And it may also be interesting to look at markets and think about how new markets will be created to respond to transition pressures. So will there be new ways of using energy or distributing energy? As I mentioned, energy exports may have a profound effect upon the decisions that are made by businesses. If you think back to Duncan Burt's comment about the rollout or actually the phase out of coal, when the market signals reached a point, the companies almost made their own decision to decommission their coal plants because they could see that there was no business future for it. So in that case, macroeconomic market forces drove decisions indirectly towards phase out. There's some really interesting opportunities around maritime energy for ferries, fishing boats, etc., and also for aircraft. And although these are often considered some of the more difficult things to achieve, in fact, just on the news today on our local radio station, Logan Air, our local airline, has announced that it's going to phase out the use of carbon in the next 20 years. And it was telling the public, which we already knew, that there's going to be trials of electrical, hybrid and hydrogen airplanes in Orkney this year to see which ones are going to start to be used on their routes. So that transition, even for airlines, is beginning to take place. And we also need to think about the resource mix. So currently in Indonesia, there's been quite a large focus, quite rightly, on land-based renewables and how they could be used. If you look at the scale of resources that there are in and around the seas of Indonesia, it may be helpful to look at the blue energy resources, and that includes particularly floating solar along with offshore wind, wave, tide, and possibly thermal energy, and thinking about these resources for export. And then the other part of the planning process is very specific to PLN and the RUPTL, and looking at the business plan and the system development for electricity over a future period. And this is obviously an important tool in helping Indonesia deliver its carbon abatement and energy needs in the future. And so it already has quite a strong regional focus, but because it's focused on electricity, which is quite right because it's PLN's plan, there's maybe a gap there in terms of, well, how does Indonesia deal with the transport related developments that are going to take place, and how do we integrate the use of electricity, which is currently provided for homes and businesses, with the electricity that's going to be depended upon for transport, and how is that going to be developed in the future? And one of the other parts, I think, in here is around storage and balancing. As we heard again from National Grid, there are no barriers from their point of view to the level of renewables that can be sustained on a grid. They're quite happy now to get to 100% of renewable capacity, and they believe the technological solutions are there to allow that to happen. So how does the grid not only deliver energy, but actually have the storage and balancing capacity to mean that that energy can be delivered from 100% renewables in the near future? And so just to finish off with, then, we maybe need to think about how we're going to move from strategies to plans and projects. And this is about making it real. One of the questions that was asked again this morning, how do we get from all of these great ideas to practical on-the-ground decarbonisation? So the good news is that that is happening. There are projects being promoted, and there are initiatives that are underway, and there are industry partners, businesses that are promoting and installing real projects. There are communities that are seeking real solutions, and there are government and other international sponsored initiatives that are making real change. And the challenge now is to increase those numbers, increase the scale of those projects, and to keep delivering progressive energy strategies that help support that, not only the energy ambition, but also the wider social and economic ambitions, and building that greater resilience. So the core building blocks of any project are outlined here in these 6 bubbles. So we need a market, we need a technology, we need supporting technologies, you need a site, you need a plan for implementation, and you need supporting policy at all levels. And that may sound very simple, it's very complicated to deliver that, but that's what we have to do. And if any of those parts is missing, then the initiative is going to fail. But there's lots and lots of experience that you have in Indonesia now of delivering projects and making this work. So it's spreading that message, getting it more widely distributed, and making sure that wherever you are in whatever part of Indonesia and whatever energy system is being used, there's a pathway that can be followed. And pilot projects, I think, again, we heard right at the start with Pat Harris and talking about some of the initiatives that are underway. It's only by demonstrating these types of projects, and all of the examples here are in Indonesia, that that we make progress. And the fact that we've got larger scale projects coming through, smaller scale projects coming through, it's, if you like, going back to maybe where the UK was 10, 15 years ago, but it's not going to take 10 or 15 years for you to reach and overtake where the UK is now. And that's another important part of this idea of leapfrogging. You shouldn't have the aspiration within Indonesia to follow our performance and follow our line in the UK. You need to accelerate past it and get to a better outcome, because you've got a tremendous opportunity to do that. And the resources and the richness of the resources in Indonesia are phenomenal, and the need is also acute as well. So that message is that the carbon transition isn't all about the negatives, it's also about the positives, and the huge positives that are going to come in their own right, but also the positives associated with missing out on all of the negatives that would come by not making the transition. So the incentive for change is immense, and that's why every country in the world now, with America coming back into it, every country in the world is committed to these changes. And so we need to keep on that path, and all of us in government, in business, in communities, in academia have got a role to play throughout society in helping make that transition possible. And that needs to be a clear focus. Is it going to help? Is there something in the way? How do we take the thing out in the way, out of the way, and keep making progress? And so in addition to the work that's been done to date in Indonesia, which has outlined around 180 gigawatts of terrestrial renewables, what we're trying to explore at the moment is how we can add to that with some blue energy potential, which isn't just matching that, it's actually exceeding that. Because of the volume of the seas and the capacity of the seas to generate energy, we believe that there's perhaps another 5, 6, maybe even 10 times the amount of energy in the sea that can be used to support that's been identified on the land. And that not only helps Indonesia meet its own domestic demand, it can also help plug this export gap that's going to come as coal and oil become unsellable products on a global market. And the contribution that's needed and the transition that will make is immense. Places like Jakarta will hopefully look differently when there's electric vehicles going around the streets rather than exhaust emitting vehicles. The amount of energy that's currently produced might be similar, but it's going to be produced by different means. You have the space, you have the resources to keep energy as a key part of your economy. It's just going to be a different type of energy. And that energy, as I say, will meet export needs as well as domestic energy needs. So I think that's a huge opportunity, and I hope through all of the presentations that we've seen, we've captured the enthusiasm we feel for the opportunity that Indonesia has. We've tried to share with you our experience, the good, the bad, and the ugly, to take a Clint Eastwood film. It's not easy. It's hard work sometimes, but the reason that people are committed to it is because they know that it's needed, it's essential. There is no other way to tackle this. We have to make that transition. And within Indonesia, you've got the human capacity, you've got the industrial capacity, you've got the resource capacity to make that work. And what we need to do now collectively is go on that journey and make that possible. And perhaps what the last year and a half has shown us is that things that were previously perhaps not even understood or thought to be possible are actually possible. So I'll leave you with this. Hopefully it's a dramatic picture, but hopefully an inspiring message is that we have a really, really serious problem, but we now have the best chance to solve it. So we need to believe the unbelievable, we need to imagine the unimaginable, think the unthinkable, and plan the unplannable, do the undoable, and achieve the unachievable, because simply the status quo is not an option. Terima kasih. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gareth. That's a very inspiring end presentation from yourselves, and it is. You're right. You know, you and I have been in a similar place of conversations in the last few years, and we definitely can see the enthusiasm growing and the momentum keep going up rather than going backwards. So it's that in itself is a great achievement, and we're really looking forward to keep working with colleagues in Indonesia and creating the change and making things happen. Okay, so Mas Sandra, I'm sorry to ask you if you could please make the last poll available so that we could see what everybody's thinking for the previous one, please, Mas Sandra. Do we have the result of the previous one? Thank you. That's perfect. So this was the poll that we asked you to fill in whilst Gareth was presenting. So that's really, I think, captures what everybody's thinking. So based on the information received throughout the sessions, most of you think that some of the strategies that have been done by the UK that needs to be avoided by Indonesia. Most of you think that it's the weak consistency in the national development policy. And then based on your opinion to the second question, what is the most effective innovation that can potentially be adapted or adopted in Indonesia as island nation to pick up the pace of energy transition? Most of you think it's the smart local energy system that's most applicable. And then there's a little bit of tie situation here between the waste to energy, offshore floating solar, and coal biomass co-firing. And the last question was around what will you do with the lessons learned that have been identified from the UK, the good and bad and the ugly, as Gareth pointed out. So the majority of you agree that it's to identify the benefits, adopt the good practice to enhance the positive impact. So thank you very much for that one. I'll exit this one, and Sandra, now for the next poll, please, if you could open that so participants can fill in their thoughts. And whilst waiting for this, if I could also remind you to fill in your attendance form in the link provided. And also there's a message from the organizer that the material for the presentation will be uploaded by the end of the session. And also the link to the material including the presentations, that will be also added by the recordings of those sessions. The daily recordings will be available too. So hopefully some parts which we are not able to go over in detail, you have the material for that. And if at any point throughout this training you have a follow-up questions, if you could send your questions to the email address, we'll put that forward again to Mas Agung. He'll kindly collate all of that questions and get the responses back from the speakers, and hopefully we could circulate that back to the participants, to everybody. Okay, can I take the first question or comment on the last presentations, please? And while waiting for that to come up, I could just go through some of these answers through the polls. So for the first question, it's around the greenhouse gas emissions. Indonesia is one of them. So Indonesia has proposed the net zero emission target, the national target, at the year 2060. So we're asking your opinion on whether the time frame is logical and measurable in your opinion. At the moment, it looks like half and half. 56% of you at the moment think that it's logical and measurable, and at the last, another part of the participant thinks that the time frame is a bit too long and can be shortened. So for the second question around the renewable energy development in Indonesia, which is targeted to be 23% of the national energy mix in 2025, for the development that is still a little bit slow, what are the main considerations or the main barriers that you think are in place to cause this slower uptake than what we would have liked. So there's the 29% equally of you at the moment think that it's the investment, not enough investment in renewables compared to other sectors, and also there's some policy gaps in regulations and policy. And the rest of the selection around R&D is the next one after. And yeah, okay. So for the third question, if Indonesia has the opportunity for financing, the market available and the investment, similar to that of the which the UK had, excuse me, what type of growth would the Indonesian renewable energy sector obtain compared to the UK? So a lot of you agreed that it will grow exceeding the UK, which is great to see. And then some of you think that it will grow exactly or more or less like the UK. And a large percentage of you also think that it's not really comparable. That's fair enough. We'll just give a few more minutes for people to complete the polls. In the meantime, there's a question about pilot projects. From the UK experience, what were the barriers encountered in pilot projects review that identified at early stages of the transition period of renewables? So I think you have a lot of pilot projects to choose from.
So what was quite interesting is in the early days, the technological reliability was a key issue. But that is really being dealt with over recent times because we now have 20 years of more experience and learning from those early days. So I think the other point that's often made is there money available to support pilot projects? And if you speak to investors and if you look at the amount of money that's being poured into clean technology and the energy transition, the answer is probably that there is money somewhere to support these pilot projects. It's finding the pathway through from the specific opportunity to that investment, whether that's through government or private investment or community investment. So the point then is that if the technology is ready and the money's ready, then the missing part, or one of the missing parts, is about having projects that are ready to fly. And I think that's the challenge and the opportunity, is gathering a customer or group of customers in a market and presenting that to investors with an appropriate technology. And so that's the task. And interestingly, and this is a good time to mention the Mentari program and work that it's been doing, is entirely based around that. It's about bringing these things together that allow pilot projects to be created and sharing that experience with others to make sure that more pilot projects are created as well. So yeah, we need to be able to present project prospectuses that are appropriate and sensible and well-founded to investors with the right technological solutions in place, and it will happen. And I think probably the other part to it is around the local inclusion and making sure that these projects are socially acceptable. We've talked quite a lot about that today, and what we've seen, not just in the UK, but in other parts of the world, is that people's expectations, they may have been disappointed before when projects didn't meet the standards that they have to meet, but now it's an expectation that a project does address those social issues, and so we need to make sure that it does that, whether it's a community-inspired project or a corporately inspired project or a government-inspired project. It needs to meet those agenda items.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks very much for that, Gareth. And just touching on your point on appropriate technology, in the linkages, there should be that link, a strong link between the sustainable energy policy to appropriate technology considerations. At the moment, I think we have quite a lot of linkages in around the technology matching sphere, and also about technology transfer. There are policies that have talked to that, but there's a little less about bringing in indigenous wisdom, and also having that technological independence and interdependence aspect into the selection process. And I think, like you said, having the local capabilities and considering the local cultural and acceptance, that's part of selecting the appropriate system for a particular project.
Absolutely, we refer to technology and expect the machine to do all the work, but of course, a machine needs people, and it needs lots of other things to make it work. So, and I think the other part is that we talked about change quite a lot today. We're in a fast-changing world, and I know that there's some really quite robust and quite insightful processes that are used in Indonesia to review what technologies are applicable at any particular time. But it's that point, at any particular time, and the pace of change is such that any technology review probably needs to happen at least on an annual basis, and possibly even on a 6-monthly basis, because the performance, the deployability, the reliability, the cost, and the range of options that are available are exploding at the moment because of the amount of investment and focus that's going into this. So if probably one of the most difficult jobs in the energy mix at the moment is keeping up with the technological options that are available. So it's just interesting to think and reflect on that if you're believing that the technology isn't there, it might be appropriate to go and just check whether it's suddenly become available, because there's a lot around at the moment.
Thank you, Gareth. Okay, Masandra, can I ask you to close the poll, please? And I hope that participants can see what everybody's thinking at the latest stage. So hopefully everybody can see that. Most of you agree that the time frame is logical and measurable for 2060. And also, most of you now think, 31% of you think that the gap is in the policy and regulatory sphere, followed closely by the less investment of renewables in compared to other sectors, other energy sectors. And then the third question, most of you agree that if Indonesia has the financial opportunity and the market and investment similar to that of what the UK had to develop its renewable energy technology, it will definitely grow to exceed what the UK has achieved. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating in that poll. Okay, can I move on to the next slide, please, Masandra? Thank you again. So that concludes all of the material and discussions that we have for the introductory training. Sorry. Now we're looking ahead. We are going to ask you to be involved in planning the advanced training session. So it would be great to follow up some of the aspects that have started to emerge from our interactions this last 3 days, and create and formulate a coherent, more specific and tailored to your individual or group's expertise and interest in the follow-on training. So at this point, I'm also going to ask participants if you could kindly participate in the evaluation and survey form that is available through the chat box. It will help us to understand what you think have been successful or less so during these 3 days, and also help us to understand on which topics or areas of discussions are actually more relevant to you and your working group here at this point, and also which ones would you like to take forward and dig a bit deeper and have access to more resources to in the future. So if you could help us fill in that form, that would be brilliant, please. Next slide, please, Masandra. Thank you. So this is just to touch on a little bit of what at the moment we're thinking about for the advanced in-depth training. Again, we would like to emphasize that we would like more engagement from the potential participants so that we can create an informed lesson plan for the future. And then the other aspects that we would like to introduce in this follow-on introductory training is that it's a blended learning method, so a combination between an online or face-to-face, if such a time is available towards the end of the year, modules, but also individual tailored workshops, which then creates that participatory learning environment from you as the participants and also from ourselves as a part of the knowledge exchange community. So it would be very interesting to get into that space, workshop space, where we could have that bidirectional conversation about what can work and what needs to put forward and develop. Again, on the study visits, seeing is believing, experiential learning, we could do this in a number of ways. You know, of course, face-to-face is ideal, but there are some virtual mechanisms that we now discovered are available to us as well because of the COVID world, like Gareth has indicated earlier. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what we have are thinking of, and hopefully will develop with your input throughout the next few months. So next slide, please, Masandra. At this point, I think it would be good to have some remarks from the embassy if David is in the forum.
Hi, Nia.
Or hi, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much for allowing me to say a few closing remarks. And I'm just going to I'm going to speak in English, but because I'm not yet fluent. But before I do, selamat siang semuanya. Saya David Lupman, Kepala Pembangunan Berkelanjutan dari Kedutaan Besar Inggris di Jakarta. So I just want to thank Pat Krishnawan from Aneka Energi, and of course to all of you attending today. I'd also like to thank the Mentari team, particularly colleagues from Aquaterra and UK National Grid. So these sessions, they're really part of our broader UK-Indonesia Mentari low carbon energy partnership, and we hope that further UK expertise that we can provide will be useful for ESDM, PLN and other ministries in government to help deliver our mutual objectives to accelerate energy transition, particularly with the government's recent and very, very welcome commitments around net zero. So we will soon be sharing with ESDM and others a case study which details the UK's energy transition journey, and we're hoping to pull out aspects from that which may be replicated in Indonesia to inform our further work together through the Mentari policy and regulatory strand, where we're supporting ESDM on policy and regulation. And I noted from the questionnaires around the need for policies and regulations to allow energy transition to accelerate. So we're really happy to be working with ESDM in that sense. And actually, I'm just going to we'll also try and cover within that the learning from pilots within the UK, and what's gone well and what hasn't gone so well. So perhaps if they're replicated in Indonesia, they'll we can share that learning, and it will be able to progress projects more smoothly. Because whilst the UK's made giant leaps in terms of its transition, it's not always been a smooth ride. So we're happy to share our learning in that respect. And also we do have a demonstration or a pilot project on the island of Sumba, which is around solar, solar project, but it's with battery storage. So we're also happy to share our learning from that. That's not online yet, but it will be operational in December, and we're working with PLN and the Sumba government and ESDM obviously very closely on that project. So also happy to share learning from that. So as I said, the Mentari program is working closely with ESDM on policy and regulation, but we're also talking and working with our UK Energy Ministry, Ofgem, which is our power sector regulator, and of course UK National Grid, to see how we can share more of their expertise, not just in sessions like this, but through our broader Mentari work. So if there's anything more that we can help, that we can do to help, do contact me or my team or Mentari program colleagues here, and we'd be happy to continue deepening our partnership further to support what we feel are our shared objectives in the partnership that we've established. So lastly, I'd just like to say I hope you enjoyed the sessions and found the course useful, and we'd be happy to run it again and we'll look closely at the feedback to make sure that we're delivering against your needs. If we do repeat it or we move into delivering more advanced sessions. So thank you very much, and terima kasih banyak semua.
Thanks very much, David, for that closing remarks. I'd like to now invite Pak Krisnawan. Pak Kris, mohon waktunya untuk menutup acara.
Terima kasih. Ya, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Yang saya hormati Mr. David Lutman, Kepala Sustainable Development Team Kedutaan Besar Inggris Jakarta, Mr. Dan Kembert, Mr. Craig Daik dari National Grid Group, kemudian juga Dr. Mark Hull, Community Energy Scotland, Head and Innovation, para narasumber, Mr. Gareth Davis, Mr. Ian Johnston, Mr. Gaynor Jones, Mr. John Toulis, dan Ibu Mbak Nia juga, para undangan serta pelatihan yang berbahagia. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, selamat sore dan sejahtera untuk kita semua. Puji dan syukur kehadiran Tuhan Yang Maha Esa atas berkat rahmat dan karunia-Nya sehingga pada hari ini dalam keadaan sehat walafiat kita diberi kesempatan untuk dapat menyelesaikan pelatihan manajemen jaringan listrik dan integrasi energi terbarukan dalam transisi energi, yang merupakan kerjasama antara pemerintah Indonesia dan pemerintah Inggris Raya dalam program Mentari. Para hadirin yang kami hormati, dalam 3 hari pelatihan telah diikuti sekitar 120 peserta dari kementerian, lembaga, dan PT PLN Persero dengan beberapa materi sangat berguna dan sangat bermanfaat bagi pengembangan energi di Indonesia nantinya, yaitu antara lain perjalanan transisi energi di Inggris Raya, studi kasus energi berbasis kepulauan, solusi inovatif untuk mengatasi tantangan transisi energi berbasis kepulauan, dasar sistem energi terbarukan, prinsip desain jaringan listrik di Inggris, aturan dan standar, integrasi dan keandalan jaringan listrik, masalah dalam integrasi energi terbarukan, dan juga adanya lanskap kebijakan energi terbarukan di Inggris Raya dan di Indonesia, serta peluang bagi Indonesia untuk mengembangkan transisi energi. Dengan telah selesainya pelaksanaan pelatihan ini, semoga kita dapat memetik pelajaran dari Inggris Raya yang memiliki kapabilitas, keahlian, dan rekam jejak yang sangat baik dalam bidang teknologi dan manajemen jaringan kelistrikan, terutama dalam hal transisi energi melalui pembangkit dan integrasi sistem energi terbarukan ke dalam jaringan listrik, termasuk kebijakan untuk sistem kepulauan. Para hadirin yang kami hormati, akhir kata kami ucapkan terima kasih kepada seluruh peserta, narasumber, serta semua pihak yang turut berpartisipasi dalam acara pelatihan ini. Dan tak lupa kami ucapkan terima kasih yang sebesar-besarnya kepada pemerintah Inggris Raya, tim program Mentari, dan Aquatera yang telah membantu terselenggaranya acara ini dengan sangat baik. Semoga penyelenggaraan pelatihan ini dapat membantu pemerintah Indonesia, khususnya Kementerian SDM, dalam mengembangkan, merenegosiasikan, dan menjalankan strategi energi terbarukan yang lebih progresif demi mewujudkan dekarbonisasi yang sesuai dengan tingkat nasional dan daerah. Dengan mengucapkan Alhamdulillah, pelatihan manajemen jaringan listrik dan integrasi energi terbarukan dalam transisi energi kami tutup secara resmi. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih, Pak Kris. Thank you again, David and Pak Kris, for closing this event. Now, just as the last few words before we log off, I'd like to remind all participants that if you have further questions or if you have further comments on the training, the 3-day trainings, please do put in your questions or comments to Mas Agung. agungiswadi@aquatera.co.uk. The email will be provided in the closing slides. And also, all of the material. You can access this after the sessions, and the team from Bahasa Global will provide the link to access the material and recording for all of the days available. So overall, from the Mentari team, we would like to say thank you very much to everybody, kepada rekan-rekan dari Kementerian SDM atas kerjasamanya yang luar biasa, dan juga kepada rekan-rekan peserta atas partisipasi aktifnya, and colleagues in the UK for your time and enthusiasm, as always, and our apologies for any shortcomings in the following, in the previous few days, and looking forward for a follow-up together for future work as well. Thanks very much, everybody. Mari.
Terima kasih semuanya.
Bagus sih bahannya.
Ini materinya ya Pak.
Udah bisa di ini nih. Ada sudah di mute ya. Bu, teman-teman di DAK ya. Ya. Pertama kita siapkan juga undangan ya. Untuk membahas lebih detail dengan ISID ya. Terkait dengan TF3 proposal.